Right. Hello, members of the Audit Committee, and welcome to the Monday, 12th of July meeting of the committee itself. You will see from apologies when we get to it that I have been asked by the chairman to stand in for herself as she is unable to be with us. So, moving on to the agenda, the first item is apologies for absence.
Apologies received from Councillors Rawlins and King, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you. Agenda item 2 is declarations of members' interests. Does anybody want to declare anything? No hands are raised, so nothing to declare. Item 3 is the minutes of the meeting held on the 14th of June this year, 2021. And I'll go through it page by page for accuracy. If anybody's got any comments, please raise them. So, the first page is on page 5 of the pack. Anybody got any comments on that? Page 6. Page 7. Page 8 and page 9. Would somebody like to propose that these minutes are signed as an accurate
Quite happy to move that, Chairman.
Seconds.
Happy
Thank you very much, Councillor Stokes. Agenda item 4 is the internal audit opinion on the adequacy of the Council's governance, risk and control environment and delivery of the internal audit plan for 2021. And you can see that the actions recommendations are there as set out, and I believe that Lucy is going to present this report for us.
Thank you, Chairman. So this report is designed to give you my independent and objective opinion around the adequacy and effectiveness of the Council's governance framework and internal control systems. It also gives you information on how we've discharged and the outcome of the internal audit work, and anything that we feel that should be drawn to the attention of the annual governance statement. So the details of the reports are on page 11 to 44, but I will just bring out the key messages for you. So overall, the opinion is a positive opinion. The internal audit service continues to work well with the audit committee in helping the council maintain the effective governance and risk and control processes. Informing my opinion, I've drawn assurance from other assurance intelligence across the council, including the combined assurance reports, information from the governance group, also from direct discussions with the executive directors and some selected key stakeholders, plus the risk management arrangements. So the opinion isn't just about the outcome of internal audit work. I have to give an opinion across the whole of the council's governance, risk and control framework. So my opinion has also took into account the environment that we've been working in. Good governance processes need to be robust and effective in a moment of crisis. So just to give that insight that this opinion has been drawn on that. So overall, you can see that governance, internal control and financial control is performing adequately. And performing adequately in accountants and audit speak is a green amber. So that is again, a positive a control environment and governance arrangements. It recognises that we as a county council work in a complex environment, and that there will always be areas where there is an amber assurance level. But I have, in terms of my independence and objectivity, look at it in the round and take into account the overall delivery. So the details supporting my opinion can be found in the main appendix, and obviously the report is designed to give you that rationale, so hopefully that sets out my rationale for come into my opinion. Also, in the context of the annual governance statement, our work has helped inform that, and that's on the next agenda item. So in terms of delivery of the audit plan, the first half year we did focus on completing work and impact of the pandemic and responding to requests for rapid assurance needed by management, and obviously we gave you updates during the year on that. It has been, I would say, a very demanding year for staff due to the impact of lockdown, both professionally and personally. The delivery of the audit plan, as reported during the year, has had an impact in terms of resources and COVID in terms of availability and pauses of audits when other priorities in terms of the council's response. But I'm really pleased to say that even with those challenges, the teams delivered 92% of the revised plan that was presented to you, and that's been with the support of the audit committee and management in helping that audit process be delivered. So the other key things to know is that I've not experienced any impairment to my independence and objectivity, so we have had free and unfettered access in all our work. I've not had any unexpected restrictions of scope for our work, but we have, as stated, had some difficulties gaining access to some staff, which did result in some delays in the planned work, and it impacted on expected timescales, which is outlined in the KPIs. Delivery of our IT audit work still remains challenging. But we do use specialised auditors to deliver that work, and we do leverage the Executive Director Commercial to help us when we get some delays or some issues in the audit process. But despite that challenge, we have managed to deliver those audit work, and also I don't consider that restricted, my opinion. So in terms of quality assurance, we are working to some recognised public sector internal audit standards. We conform to those standards, but I'm also drawing the attention, as part of those standards, we have a quality assurance framework that looks at continuous improvement. So I've outlined some of the key areas, particularly our audit process is how we're going to adapt and revise those for working more remotely. We've always been flexible and working where the work is, but obviously smarter working and the new technology can help us do that more. So we will be looking at efficiencies to improve both productivity and optimise the way we work going forward. The other areas is obviously around capacity and succession planning. We've recently recruited some more staff, but we continue to have capacity challenges, notwithstanding a recent common request of a key member of our staff to help the business with a key project. So I've drawn those areas to the attention of the committee, and also to let you know that we are due for an external assessment next year, so we will be engaging with yourselves through that with a report on the process for doing that. We have a full external self-assessment, so the auditors are going to be audited. So a lot of my management colleagues do find that quite amusing. So I think that's really the report being presented for any comments or questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I am intrigued by the cover pictures you choose, Lucy. You see, you've got divine endorsement of this report. Some of the others I'm a bit bemused by, the open scrubland and so on. But seriously, Chairman, you mentioned capacity challenge. It's something that you've reported to us a few times, that, keeping good staff, in a supportive authority, and it must look good on your CV when you've worked at Lincolnshire County Council, is a challenge. You mentioned smarter working arrangements. I wonder if you could give us some examples, and what sorts of efficiencies might such smarter working result in?
Okay, So the council's launched a smarter working policy, but some of those things involve, for the audit process, it's around use of technology in teams more for discussions, audit process. So we're looking at saving time travelling, time in travel. Some things do need a combination. There are some things, particularly with the audit process, where you do need to meet people face to face if that's the conversation that you need to have. So it's making that hybrid approach to the ways we work. We were, as I said, already quite agile, so we were pretty paperless beforehand because we have audit software, but it's making the most use of the technology available through Teams and having that hybrid process so that we can look at more efficiencies, I think, through save time in travelling in a rural county.
Councillor Stokes.
Thank you, Chairman. No, I mean, overall, the report, I think, considering the year we've had, is fairly good. But I do have concerns at Appendix 3 on page 41, and it's the overdue actions. I mean, there's some actions going back to January 2019. Are we any closer to getting these completed? Because obviously there's quite a few medium ones there, and they just seem to be rolling on. Thank you, Chairman.
We do track them. I'll be able to hand over to Matt Waller, who will be able to give you the details, but we do track them every quarter, and we do look at those for their relevance, whether they still stack up, because obviously since then a lot's changed in the control environment. So there is that accountability, but we can obviously go and have a bit of a more deeper dive and bring a separate paper on those recommendations to the committee at a future meeting, if that's something. But Matt, can you please give an update on the recommendation tracker for me, please?
Yep, thanks, Lucy. I was just going to say, at the next progress report, we could provide some detail on how those are progressing and sort of the expected dates for those to give the committee a bit more of an overview of that.
Thank you, Chair. Lucy, again, I would say in the year that we had, I'd echo Councillor Stokes' view. That is a tremendous job done. I'm aware of a lot of internal audit functions that have ridiculously suffered and have been unable to give opinions and a lot of areas. So to get to that point, great job, well done. Obviously, you know me well enough to go, there's the but coming now that goes right, the next set of questions. There's two, if I may, really. Number one is on page, I think it's 16 on this one. It's point 16, excuse me, on page 13. The paragraph worries me. The delivery of our ICT remains challenging. We continue to utilise specialised ICT audit to deliver most technical reviews, and the Executive Director Commercial helps support the audit process. That seems to me a series of flags, because there's lots of gaps, and what are you actually trying to say, is my first question. My second question is a bit more broad, in that what the pandemic has kicked out in a lot of businesses is things that we would naturally place assurance on that were working before no longer work. So the shelf life of some of the controls, some of the things that we'd naturally rely on before, are no longer valid. So whilst we're getting assurances and the new assurances, which ones have gone past their expiry date because the world's changed? So where are we going to get blindsided by stuff that we knew was working, or we thought we could take at least a couple of years assurance from? We've literally only take a couple of months because it's changed. Does that make sense? Thank you.
Thank you. So with ICT, as you're aware, that's a majority of the processes are delivered with an external partner. So in terms of the audit process, that does bring some challenges and complexity in getting it through the door. So it takes longer, it takes more time and effort from our team, and the closure meetings take longer. So it's a real challenge in terms of contemporary reporting, and we tend to have to escalate it to get reports and things finished through the executive director. It's really, and also it represents the pressure the ICT have been under this year. So it was a combination of things, but we always find these technical areas, because there's so many people involved, just take a bit longer, and I'm drawing that to the attention of the committee, really. It is an amber, I think, and that's why I've put it in there. But we have delivered the audit reports. Matt is the one that's on the sharp end of that, so I'm going to hand over for Matt to give a response of what it's like in practice.
Thanks, Lucy. I think there's two things for me here. Is one, that IMT are so essential to the council, that doing the audits as well, you know, we acknowledge that they're very busy and they're very stretched across what they do. And that does impact a little bit on getting the work done. But I think the other thing is that you can take assurance that your audit team will just continually liaises and pushes and communicates. And actually that the audits that we've got delivered for 2021 is a step forward, I think, for IMT. And we've got good liaison with them now, and we've got some good audits in the plan for 21-22. So we continue to work with them just to improve how that works.
And I know there's always constant pressure on those areas because it's a case of which you want me to do. Do you want me to do the audit? Do you want me to deliver? And that's fine. But again, I'd just wrap that up with what's on page 22, which is the fact that then we have a whole series of low assurances and limited assurances in the IT space as well. So it's building a picture that, again, is just giving the council assurance that we've got a lot of pressures on there. We know there's a lot of challenges in there. We know that all the data security, GDPR, everything to do with cyber, it's a lot of pressure in one particular area. And it's just, say, from my perspective, reading all those pieces, flagging to me that we've got a lot of things that need a look at. And again, it's always a constant challenge to us. How do we get assurance in that area when you've got such an interesting world?
Can I just come back on that, Chair? Is that all right? I think it's really good that we've been able to complete some audits in that area, and we've got even more planned for this year. So then the committee will then get to see those reports coming through in progress, and you'll be able to track that recommendations are being implemented. So hopefully that will give a bit of a wider assurance to the committee that IMT are making those improvements on where we're finding those things. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Skinner, you had a hand up.
Yes, thank you very much. I take a bit of comfort that nothing's been hidden. All those items are there and flagged up well. One other thing that was really of comfort to me, it's about culture. And I know this particular department has a culture of constant improvement. So that is really where we are. And also it always comes back to this committee so we can actually have a go as well. So all the controls I would see there. So I'm quite happy to move the report in line with the recommendations. Thank you.
Just one moment. Lucy, you've got something to say.
Only as much, there's another question that was asked by Ian around control environment. Obviously, I just answered the IMT question, so I just wanted to finish that off. On the IMT feedback from Ian, though, we can take that back to the chairman and vice chairman pre-briefing to see if there's any more assurance that you want to seek from the accountable managers or the commercial director on IMT, so we can do that too. So moving on to your other question around the control environment and the assurance going forward, Councillor Coupland at the last meeting asked for a briefing around the control environment in the smart working. So we will be bringing something back, going back to basics, looking at what you expect in a control environment and how that's been impacted. So we are bringing that forward. So that should give you that assurance going forward, not just looking back from my report.
Thank you, Lucy. I think we all look forward to that briefing on smarter working and the consequences. There's been a proposal from Councillor Skinner that we have reviewed the report and made comments on it and can accept it. Is anybody going to second that? Oh, you wanted to speak? Sorry.
It is purely on the smarter ways of working, which Mr Middleton brought up and you've commented upon. Nothing is proven in this smarter way of working across the country. There's no national briefings you can look at, work with, and that really concerns me because how many thousand people have we got working for LCC? Majority of them working from home. Is it really more efficient than we have been working in the offices 18 months or 2 years ago? Is the productivity there? It really concerns me because it affects every single service we provide. And we're here to make sure we've got good efficiencies, we've got good productivity. It really concerns me with all councils. You know, some are here, some are there. Now, we accept that probably it's good for officers to do some work at home, because if they've got the peace and quiet, they're doing a good report, that's great. I think that's always been done. That's always been accepted. But to go completely opposite and work other way in the percentages, we have to be so careful. And I think as an audit committee, and we're looking at quality assurance, we have to make sure that what's coming out of the audit department, and they take their details from all the service managers there is, that we're actually going to be more efficient and with more productivity.
Thank you, Councillor Cooper. I think we're all share your concerns to a certain extent. There are many organisations in local government that have been working on a smarter way for quite a period of time, and have shown that it can work, particularly on its hybrid form, you know, where it's not necessarily working 5 days a week away from home. But as we've already heard, there is going to be a briefing note prepared and submitted to the council that hopefully will answer the questions that you are raising, that we all have some concern about. You wanted to say something finally on this item.
Thank you. Yeah, just to give that assurance, so the audit committee's role is around how things are done, so we will be looking into that deeper dive, but also the council has been operating in the last year through remote working, and the annual governance process, which is the next paper, and my review sort of hopefully gives you that insight that the governance arrangements, the risk and control framework was robust enough to stand and adapt to that. What we're going to do is that forward look. So you will get that deeper dive in assurance coming to you.
Sorry, one final question.
Well,
is it Andrew?
It is on the same subject, Chairman. I share Councillor Copeland's anxiety. Not that I have any disbelief in the commitment and integrity of officers, but the sheer practicalities of remote working, we may have a hidden loss of productivity, loss of effectiveness, loss of control. And I guess when we're looking at the internal audit plan, we'd be asking the internal audit team to do some audit work that actually gave answers to the anxieties that Councillor Copeland and some of us share. So that would help to give us assurance, and it may be other organisations have done similar internal audit work that we can borrow their template. But I believe in another organisation, we've had a 10% increase in attendance at meetings, and we've had no loss of productivity in terms of contributions to decision making, but we haven't got that objective, measurable assurance.
Well, I think we need to wait the briefing note that Lucy's preparing, and it will presumably include some sort of information about how we can assess the impacts of smarter working to belay any of the concerns that we've got, or to show how we can overcome those concerns. Thank you. I did have a proposal from Councillor Skinner, and I mistakenly thought Councillor Copeland was going to second it. You will second it, thank you. So moving on to agenda item 5. Sorry? Oh yes, I suppose we had better vote on it, please. Will voting members please put their hands up if they accept it? And anybody that's against, or anybody abstaining? I think that might be unanimous, but I'm not totally sure. Right, moving on to agenda item 5. This is a report on the Council's governance arrangements and approval of the annual governance statement. And it's going to be by Lucy again. Can you please introduce the report?
Thank you, Chairman. So the annual governance statement is open and honest assessment of how well the council is run and is at the heart of the council's governance, risk and assurance framework. So the council is required under the account and audit regulations to make this statement, but it's also good practice to have that review and assessment. This year's statement includes the pension fund. There's been some changes in their code, so there's a section included on the pension fund throughout. The statement itself is corporately, although I'm presenting it, it's a corporately developed statement that has been signed off by the corporate leadership team, and it's being presented to the committee to ensure, from your understanding and knowledge of how well the council's been run, that the statement stacks up. And that it's required for you to approve and recommend it for signing by the Chief Exec, the Section 151 and the leader. The leader has had sight of the draft and, as I say, they are required to sign it off. The statement includes information on the outcomes of the council, which includes delivery of the corporate plan approved by the council in September. It also has a big section, as you would imagine, around the council's response and recovery to COVID. It has a section more on value for money. Value for money is about obviously effectiveness, efficiency and the economy arrangements of the council, and there's a section within the report that outlines that, particularly around financial resilience, the medium-term financial plan, and how we deal with commercial activities within the council. The review of the arrangements are coordinated through the governance group. Information is received from a number of key stakeholders and, as I say, signed off by the corporate leadership team. And overall, the corporate leadership team has concluded that there are no significant governance issues, sort of showstoppers, but they have identified some areas of continuous improvement where systems and processes are being adapted or refocused. And those are outlined on page 12, 49 of the pack, paragraph 12, 49 of the pack, and 80 to 81 of the main statement. So the statement overall, to conclude, represents a large and complex, varied organisation. It also recognises the environment that we operate, but as I said in my previous report, the governance, risk and control framework has stood up to the challenges of COVID in the last year, so and overall performed well as per the assessment. So I'm happy to take questions.
Yes, Andrew.
Don't demur from the view that it's a well-run organisation and governance controls are pretty sound. But on page 82, there's my disappointment. I'd have been very much happier if it read performing well on all those 4 key areas. Now, some of the restraint on getting to a performing well judgment might be specific to COVID and the abnormality of the year, but could I ask, Lucy, has the team got a very clear action plan with timescales of what needs to be done to be able to lead to judgments of performing well on all those 4 areas rather than just the one at the moment?
So on page 82 is my opinion. So I am a bit more cautious than the management. So being clear that that is my opinion that I've just gone through. So I did get some pushback on the use of performing adequately within the organisation. But this was recognised that as an independent and objective opinion, I was a bit more cautious around some of the changes that have been identified within the main areas of improvement. So in answer to your question, there are action plans and clear areas of improvement, continuous improvement through our performance framework. and the corporate leadership team on various aspects of those areas have separate action plans. So we're not making another action plan for those areas, but they're embedded as part of continuous improvement with our processes. So I am anticipating some of those to work through this year, and I am anticipating that my opinion is going up. But it is important that I may have a different view than the organisation, because I have to make that judgment based on evidence, and some of that work is still in progress.
Ian. Ian, you've got your hand up.
Thank you. Lucy knows well that I've sat where she sat, and nobody's ever happy. Especially when you've got something that is something performing well and performing adequately, and they're always pushing a case of, well, what do I actually specifically have to do? I completely endorse those ratings based on what I've seen over the year in terms of where would I sit, and again with that slight err on caution, I completely agree. When we start seeing some of the feedback from perhaps the monitoring officers about some of the areas that we've had challenges in, it's about the direction of travel for me. I think that's actually the more thing in, and the direction of travel certainly in the last year has taken a big hit. And to continue to go on the front foot in that space is really important. Especially for me when we have a look at financial control, especially with internal control, because the game's changed. So actually comes back to that smarter working, everything else, that says actually what's our view on, is there any things we're really worried about? There's areas we're worried about, we're always going to, as Lucy said, we're very complex and diverse infrastructure as well as anything else. So for me, I just want to say I think that's actually a very valid audit opinion, head of internal audit opinion. And I think the question would be is, have we had any feedback from the executive that structurally challenges this, as opposed to actually just saying, well, what would I need to do something better? So do the executive recognise, the flight path? Do they recognise the challenges, and do they recognise the areas where you said, actually, this isn't good enough?
This statement has been developed by the corporate leadership team, so they endorse it, and they recognised it was so I mirrored back, so the information within the annual governance statement was a reflection back to the intelligence gathered by my conversations with them. So it was, so they've absolutely owned and identified those areas, and that's why, and they're part of the performance framework to monitor. So yes, they have owned it. In terms of when you use executive in the political terms, this statement has been shared with the leader. He's comfortable with that, subject to any changes the committee might make. I would draw your attention to the executive summary, where again the three officers, the two officers, statutory officers and the leader, recognises that there's still work to do, and there were some areas that they would have liked to make further progress. But again, overall, considering the environment that the council was operating, the governance and assurance framework stood up to the crisis.
I've got a question, Lucy. Do you feel that there is any concerns about a situation that might occur in terms of the fact that we've had a significantly difficult year as we went through 2020 with the COVID pandemic, and we are then moving into a reaction to COVID to a certain extent, which is smarter working, with all the implications that's got, in that we might not be able to assess the consequences of one thing, the consequence of another thing, and the change that might have taken, the change that has taken place to the original situation, which was pre-COVID.
I can't really give you an answer from that, but what I can say around how things are being managed and the risk and assurance intelligence is mirrored in the performing well on risk management. So the corporate leadership have a real handle on the risks and issues facing the council. So there's regular intelligence going through that. So if there are any concerns, they're identified through a framework that works well.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Copeland?
Yeah, I think Mr Middleton keeps stealing my thunder, really. Yeah, it is this performing adequately. It's two words that can mean anything, really. And in my mind, it means that somewhere in the establishment there's some poor performance and somewhere there's some very good performance. So it's put them together, it's adequate. So I don't think that's really good. It's not sounding good at all. And just above that, those four boxes there, it says with staff working remotely. We're coming back to working from home. Is there a link that our performing adequately has come about through working at home, not effective and with no productivity? Has that been the smarter way of working? I'll just leave it at that, really.
Yes, an interesting question, please. And what's the answer?
I can only reiterate this is my opinion on and adequate is a standard auditing word. So it does mean things are working okay, but also my cautiousness is because it is still we're still working through that. So again, I assess that things are working okay, but acknowledging the environment that we're working in, that things have changed because we've changed the delivery sort of operating model. So I can only reiterate that it's a cautious opinion by your head of internal audit, acknowledging that it's had an impact. And I don't think any organisation will say that it has not any impact, both positive and areas for learning. So I don't think it's anything more than just the governance arrangements are working okay, and it's green and amber, and it's not making any assessment on performance. It's about controls and the processes. So I can't really answer those questions around what you're asking around productivity, but we have continued to deliver our services, and we still continue to deliver those well. As you can see through the annual governance statement on the outcomes.
I just got a question to take that, well, not forward, but to try and understand it. Is adequate a reasonable technical term in assurance insurance areas? So we shouldn't see any criticism in terms of you using the word adequate.
No.
Right, thank you.
Thank you very much, Chairman. I'm going to do a bargain bundle. I'm going to link a few things, whether I should do or not. I'm still going to. Safeguarding adults is amber, but says substantial. We move down then, bottom of the same page. It says market supply, adequate of market supply, and that is about residential care, etc. That says amber and limited. Then I move on to the next page, ensuring contracts and markets, it does say other than adult care, but I do have concerns where things are showing limited and other things are saying substantial, because if any of those columns breaks down, it could actually end up with our safeguarding being in a state as well. So there's the bargain bundle. I'll let you explain to me that the safeguards are adequate on those bits. Thank you.
Can you respond?
Yes, I'll start again. So as your head of internal audit, I'm a part of the third line of assurance, so I'm not in place to make those assessments. Those level of assurance have been put by your accountable managers. So it's quite right that you should challenge those. That's why they're in there. And it may be something that you would want to put on your forward plan to have the accountable manager here to give you more assurance on those particular risks, which I'm happy to feed back and work through the work plan going forward.
I think from the sound of it, that's what Councillor Skinner would like. Councillor Whittington, you had your hand up.
Yes, thanks, Mr. Chairman. I'm picking up from the committee in both the last two agenda items concern over smarter working. Within the council, there is a group of councillors looking at smarter working. I'm a member of that, as is the leader, Councillor Hill, and as his support councillor, I will pass all of these concerns around smarter working, productivity and control over systems and processes. I'll drop him an email as soon as this meeting's over, so he's in the picture. But I think it's fair to say that no decisions have been taken as yet. It's still very much in the stage of sort of looking around smarter working, looking at it, obviously, with this, there's going to be views on either side. And I don't think that a final decision has been taken as yet, but this is certainly something that I can feed in to that process. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Councillor Whittington. One more comment from...
Following that, Councillor Whittington, it is not our place to challenge or determine policy on smarter working. I think the committee is raising the issue of, can we objectively assess and evaluate whether or not it's effective, safe, doesn't cause impact on things like safeguarding procedures, etc. So might I suggest, Chairman, that it would be interesting to have the lead officer and or chair of the Smarter Working Committee come to meet us so we can raise some of these issues directly.
Lucy, could that be incorporated into your presentation of the briefing note on smarter working? Well, you're not incorporated into it, but take place at the same time?
It certainly can.
Any other questions on item 5? No. We have a series of recommendations, but we've had some comments about the actual report. So I think it's a question of accepting the qualifications, I think, maybe with the accepting the recommendations with the qualifications minuted that we've raised. Would everybody be happy with that? In which case, would somebody want to propose that we accept the recommendations, having duly considered it and making comments that are going to be minuted?
Quite happy to move that, Chair.
Seconded by anybody? Councillor Bunny?
Quite happy to do that.
Thank you. We now move on to item 6, which is the big one to a certain extent. I'm sure they're all equally important to a certain extent, but in pure volume, item 6 seems to be the big report. So this is the draft statement of accounts for 2021. They are draft statements and they will remain draft even after we've made comments on them. And the intention would be that once we have made comments and once any refinements might take place as a result of those comments, they go to the auditor, I think, for a more detailed assessment of figures to determine accuracies and things like that. So that I'm sure we have lots of how questions about what it says in the report. So I will open it up to... I've got to see, so apologies, to Sue to actually present the report, or are you going to do it, Michelle?
I'm going to present the report.
Right.
Thank you, Chair. I'm Michelle Grady. I'm the Assistant Director for Finance. So I'll just present the report, pick up a couple of the key changes from the previous year. I've got a couple of colleagues on the virtual call that can help with any technical or specific questions if we have them, and then open it up to ask any questions. As you've said, they are the draft accounts. They're the draft statements for 2021. They'll remain draft until we get our final audit opinion. Our external auditors, Mazars, presented their audit strategy back in March for the main LCC accounts and last month for the pension fund accounts, which are supplementary to these accounts. The Lincolnshire Pension Fund and the Fire and Rescue Pension Fund are also part of these accounts. too. The main thing I'm going to just highlight is we've prepared these accounts in line with Code of Practice, our professional Code of Practice that we're required to. They are a technical document that's effectively following recognised accounting practices, and as such they're quite a lengthy document and provide quite a lot of information in the format that we are required to provide them in. In terms of how they've changed from last year, the main impact has been the impact of the coronavirus pandemic. One of the key things that our auditors will look for when they're looking at our accounts is whether we had spent money and forecast our income in line with what we'd planned for. And clearly during 2021, we hadn't planned for the spend and the subsequent income that we received to support that spend for the coronavirus pandemic. And that is kind of littered through the accounts and littered through the key statements as well. In the accounts, and you'll see that if you work through the accounts. So we received quite a significant amount of income to support the expenditure that we incurred, and you'll see from the notes that the total funding that we received during the year was around £112 million, and we also received some money from the CCG for some commissioning we did on their behalf as well. The majority of that was spent. There has been some underspends that will be carried forward in terms of allowable carry forwards to support the pressures as they carry on into the new year. But you'll see that impacting on the statements in terms of the I&E account, and there are some separate notes as well in the accounts. And note 4 has effectively set out an extract of our income and expenditure account, which is purely based on our COVID spend to try and help members of the public and members and auditors to see how much that's impacted on our accounts during the year. The accounts are effectively a backward look, and they also include the performance on our business as usual accounts, and you'll see in the narrative statement that actually the coronavirus did impact on our normal planned budgeted spend to the extent that we underspent quite significantly actually on our normal budgets, and that has been reviewed by Overview and Scrutiny Management Board and was at Executive last week, and the proposals as the outcome of that will be going forward to Council in September. I think it's safe to say that a number of those underspends were caused by activity and resources that had to be redirected to respond to the coronavirus pandemic, and the response that we had to make in our services. And as I've said, a lot of that, all of that was covered by the additional grants that we received from government to support that. The other significant change that you'll see from the previous year, and again is kind of littered throughout our statements, is the net asset position. This is to do with the pension liability that we have, the liability to pay our pensions in the future, which has been impacted by indices on future inflation and the value of the assets in the fund to support that. And that's had a significant variance in terms of from last year's valuation to this of around £224 million. You'll see the main change there in the movement of reserves, the unusable reserves, which are effectively just our valuation reserves, and that's had a significant impact on our balance sheet. Whilst that is significant, and it's a significant difference from last year, the unusable reserves and that element of our balance sheet is not a short-term issue, it's a long-term liability, and doesn't present any immediate concern in terms of the financial sustainability of the authority. In terms of financial sustainability, you'll also see on the movement of reserves statement that the usable reserves has actually increased during the year. We maintain our general reserves, which is our basically last resort kind of pot of money to support any unplanned spend. We maintain that at just under 3.5%, which has been our policy for a number of years. We also have a financial volatility reserve, which we've maintained for a number of years to deal with any kind of short-term shortfalls in our budget to support our delivery of services, and that hasn't been called upon during the year, and you'll see that in the usable reserve statement. So I will hand over, because they are the two main kind of changes from previous years. We've not had any significant changes in accounting policies that would lead to any changes in the presentation of the accounts. So I'm just going to hand over now to see if members have got any questions on particular items in the accounts which I can help with.
Thank you. Questions? Many. Councillor Coupland first.
Yep, thank you, Mr. Chairman. On the balance sheet on page 30, we've got quite a big figure in there for property, plant and equipment. How accurate do you think the property asset value is, particularly after the year we've had? Because there's some properties that have lost value for obvious reasons and some probably levelled out, I'm not sure. It's a substantial amount, and if that figure declines 10 or 15%, that seriously affects our balance sheet. So how accurate do we think the property values are that we have?
So we have a 5-year rolling programme to revalue all of our assets. So all of our assets are looked at on a quinquennial survey basis, a quinquennial valuation, with the exception of some of our investment activity assets which are reviewed each year. I think the auditors put a kind of note of caution in the accounts last year in terms of RICS, which is the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors, asked them to effectively just note caution with any valuation that they undertook over the last year. You'll see that the valuations actually increased since last year. All of our assets is a very large number, and a number of our property assets in particular are buildings such as schools, energy from waste plant, day centres, quite a number of properties that we have around the county. And I haven't seen that reflected in the valuations that we've done this year in terms of dropping in value of property. But as I say, RICS are still noting that caution in terms of value of property generally. If there is a drop in the value of property, again, that comes through in the unusable reserves. So it's a paper exercise effectively, and that doesn't actually become a reality unless you dispose of that asset. So very much a long-term view again in terms of our property valuations. The changes in valuation gets reflected in our unusable reserves account, and that is not a cashable cost to the councils in terms of its accounts.
So you're absolutely sure that our property asset values are pretty okay, bearing in mind they've gone up during a dreadful year that we've all had?
I'm confident that our assets are valued as they should be in terms of we'll have revalued a fifth of all of our property. On a personal level, I've not experienced property prices dropping over the last year. In fact, trying to buy a house around where I live is quite difficult at the moment because they're going up so quickly. But in terms of our assets in the balance sheet, I'm confident that we've valued those at a realistic level. As I say, the auditors will probably put a note of caution in line with RICS guidance when they come to present their information back to you.
Well, property is is quite a viable asset, though, to a certain extent, isn't it? And commercial property it may well be a little bit more uncertain than residential property as well.
Absolutely. We don't have property on our balance sheet that is commercial in the sense of quite a lot of authorities have hotels, things like that. And I don't think it's the value of the asset that's been a problem for them. It's the income that's been generated from them or lack of them that's more of a problem. Our investment properties are mainly around county farms. So we give them, Savills do the valuation on those for us to make sure they're correctly represented in our balance sheet.
Thank you. Councillor Skinner, did you have your hand up? No? Oh, it's Councillor Stokes, I'm sorry.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. My first point is regarding the last paragraph on page 18. I think it needs a bit of mopping up and tidying, because there's no limited company named Lincolnshire Futures because it's named later as Lincolnshire Future, and also Lincolnshire Legal Services is not named as a limited company in that paragraph. But my main point relates on to page 132, which is in note 3 on the accruals. I'm slightly concerned. I know it's in the note 3 is an assumptions made about the future, but the accruals have significantly increased by, on your valuation, 1.6 million relating to employee leave earned but not taken. I can understand why it has not been taken during the last year, but it also says it comes from a survey, so I'm concerned about how that figure's been, we've risen to that figure, because it says if it had been more staff completed the survey, it would have been higher. So are you confident that that is a worthwhile figure? Thank you.
I think in terms of materiality, the confidence, I'm confident that what we've presented in the accounts is reasonable. We do a survey across all of our staff and ask them to it's a simple snap survey, just asking them to tell us how much leave they've got left at the end of the year, and then we obviously extrapolate across the whole workforce. It will have increased this year because we had a kind of temporary change in policy. Usually we allow staff to accrue 5 days leave as a maximum throughout the year, but that policy changed this year to obviously reflect that people were being asked to do more and so maybe couldn't take their leave, and that is obviously based on that survey. So in terms of materiality, I'm confident that what we're presenting is okay.
Andrew, you've got a query.
Thank you. 4 comments, if I may, Chairman. One, following Councillor Copeland, I'm very pleased we don't have investments in commercial property, because a shopping centre in Coventry, which was on the books for 35 million, has just sold for 5. So pleased we kept away from that. Economy, efficiency and effectiveness, the elusive 3 E's of any financial management leader. Clearly this council's pretty good at this, all 3. But Michelle, can you assure me that in the force majeure situation of a pandemic, there hasn't been an avoidance of normal controls and procedures, purchasing, for example, out of necessity and urgency and speed, such that we have lost the infrastructure robustness that does contribute to economy, efficiency and effectiveness? That's question 1. Question 2, there's been an under-demand, a depressed demand because of the pandemic, and that's some underspends on service areas. But as I know from my day job in the NHS, it doesn't go away, it comes back, and it probably comes back with greater intensity. So, for instance, the NHS is coping with a big boost in mental health challenges, and it's going to last for years. Is there any type of demand that will come back with a vengeance and or in a different form? And finally, back to this flexible, agile working scenario, lots of commercial organisations are saying they're going to get by with 30-40% less bricks and mortar. Is there a capital group that looks at whether or not the future ways of working will mean we need less by way of buildings and probably more by way of digital infrastructure?
Okay, I'll try and take each of those in terms. In terms of purchasing, all of our normal controls have operated as they should do throughout the pandemic. Fortunately, most of our controls are systems-based, and that's all been in place during the pandemic, so those controls in terms of system controls have been there throughout. What we will have seen is some re-procurements that were planned to happen over the last year will have been delayed. So we plan to go out to market again for some of our care services, and it wasn't seen as appropriate to do that whilst they're in the middle of trying to respond to a pandemic. So we've had a number of contracts that have been extended so that we can allow things maybe to try and settle down as much as they can before we start to engage with the market again about re-procuring some of those services. But that's all been done with the necessary authorisations through our decision-making process, as you would normally expect. We have bought things that we hadn't planned to buy, things like PPE and stuff like that. So, but that again has been done through our commercial team with the correct procurement and contracting requirements in place to do that, and decision making in place. So, and hopefully that's kind of reflected in the annual governance statement as well, that those controls have been operating, but as Lucy said, that we'll obviously look at that control environment going forward in terms of smarter working. In terms of under demand, there have been some services that we haven't delivered, and that has caused some underspend on our normal business, and some of those services will probably be reviewed and reflected on how they delivered going forward to make sure that we benefit from the learning that's happened over the last year. But there will be some areas where that demand starts to push through. One thing I can think of in particular is some of the public health team will have been focusing mainly on responding to COVID over the last year, hence their costs and time has been picked up by the COVID grant, but there'll be work that they need to go back to once things start to go back to normal. Underspends on the public health grant will have been kept in reserve. So again, that's partly why you can see some of our earmarked reserves have increased over the last year, because some of those specific funds will have gone back into reserve to meet that demand as and when it filters through into the system. In terms of demand pressures, we were already seeing some demand pressures on our services before the pandemic, to be honest, in some of our social care environment. And part of the transformation programme work that the council's embarked on is to look at how we deliver services to make sure that demand's being met in a way that we need to, and very much picking up on the new ways of working and whatever smarter working will bring with it, and looking how we deliver our services generally. So hopefully we're ready for any demand surge that we might get. One of the recommendations that Executive agreed last week that will go forward to Council in September as well is to create some balance in our reserves to support particularly any COVID pressures that go on beyond the funding that the government have given us. In terms of reduction in our physical property, very much part of the smarter working agenda that Councillor Whittington's mentioned. I think there is an expectation that we will reduce our physical property requirements over the next period of time, and absolutely already become very reliant on our digital ways of working, with Office 365 being rolled out and things like Microsoft Teams having been prevalent in terms of our response during COVID, and that won't change, I don't think. So it'll be part of the planning process that we go forward with this year in terms of setting our budgets for future years and our medium-term strategy, looking at what the capital receipts could be in terms of any reduction in our property, and capital receipts we would normally reinvest in our capital programme investment. So that will be all part of the planning process as we lead into the budgets for future years. Thank you.
I've got a question, and then Ian Alderby's got one after me. It goes back to the trading companies, and it may well be more to do with concerns in the future rather than concerns for the 2021 accounts. The these can lead local authorities into great difficulties. I mean, there's a situation in Liverpool where it did cause such a problem, you know, with the local authority that the government had to send in the police almost, or whatever it was. So my question is how do we assess what the risks are associated with operating these companies? And then determine, what liabilities may be coming from them, and whether that be a profit or a loss. And particularly so when we have no experience about how these companies might trade, or in many cases might trade. I mean, Transport Connect is a bit more obvious, but some of the other ones are less obvious in terms of what it is they're intending to do, unless it is quite clear in their terms and conditions or whatever it is about what it is that they can and can't do. And then it becomes a governance issue in terms of ensuring that's exactly what they can do and don't do. Perhaps unlike Liverpool, where it was left almost to the mayor to determine what was happening, and £30 million was lost over a year or something. So how do we actually ensure that we're not going to get into that sort of same scenario with the companies, particularly when they're at this early stage?
Maybe if I just start with giving you some assurance about the companies that we do have. So Transport Connect, as you say, does pretty much what it says on the tin. It's a passenger transport company. We effectively took ownership of the company and created the company as a result of failure in the market. So the plan was never to make profit out of the company. It was about operating a service and making sure our children got to school, basically. So that was the primary driver for the creation of that company. We have members, officers of the county that are part of the board of that company. It's being run by people who know how to run transport companies, so not officers of the council. It's being run by transport professionals, and we regularly see the accounts of that company and oversee the governance in terms of how it's managed. In terms of our liability, we do, it does have a loan with us, and that's all reported in the accounts. There was an executive decision made at the creation of that company about what the value of that loan couldn't exceed in terms of controls. So that was made by the executive at the time, and that's monitored through the finance team, and it will be part of the papers that are presented to the auditors as part of our working papers. The other companies that are mentioned in there's Lincolnshire Futures, which is effectively a holding company, which was created to have as an umbrella company, and Lincolnshire Property, I think it's called, neither of which have traded since they've been created. There was a view that we could trade and do some property type development, but any decision to effectively make that property company operational will need to go through executive with a business plan, like you would expect to see with any new company. So the company's been created, but it isn't operating, and there's no financial liability or operations through those accounts at the moment. And any decision to effectively make that company operational would need to go through executive for a decision to do that. Legal services, again, is pretty much what it says on the tin. We already have a shared service with our legal company that operate with the district councils. I think all but one of our district councils are now operating the shared services. But there is some activity that our districts do that we can't pick up as a public sector legal department, mainly around their commercial activity. So, and the legal services company is very much regulated by the legal services regulator. So once that starts operating, it hasn't quite started yet, but they're just waiting for their confirmation of all their certificates and things. That will come through in terms of our monitoring facilities in terms of that.
Thank you. So what you're saying, I think, is as far as property is concerned, I don't need to worry at the moment.
No, I don't know. Councillor Whittington might want to add something there, but we've not received a business case at the moment to actually do anything in terms of the operating of the property company.
I've got another question I'd like to ask, but it's nothing to do with property. If you want to talk about property first, then.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, I think when both Lincolnshire Future and Lincolnshire Property got set up, there was a kind of an idea at the time, this is about several years ago, that we might sort of look at some of our assets that we do have, sort of maybe in terms of some of our property estate that we no longer needed, around sort of commercial development allied to economic development. It was sort of a process that was sort of going through, and then I guess COVID came along. I mean, in terms of, Mr. Chair, you mentioned Liverpool. You could also mention Nottingham and Slough and various other councils across there. Hounslow and Spelthorne springs to mind as well, and some really speculative stuff that some authorities have done and have really caused tremendous financial problems for them. There is no sort of I think as Michelle said, we certainly haven't done any of that. And actually, I get the impression picking up that because of some of the lessons that have been learned and some of the impacts coming out from COVID, that I don't think the political will is there at the moment, certainly to go down this avenue. I think too many local authorities have gone down this path. It's caused them problems. It's directly linked. You look at Croydon, for instance, their entire Section 114 notice came about because they had this housing management company that looked like it had millions and millions of pounds worth of assets. In reality, it didn't, and that's what's caused them tremendous problems. You look at the issue around Nottingham City Council and their Robin Hood Energy Company, similar issues there as well. I just don't think the political appetite is there, certainly for the foreseeable future. Thank you.
Thank you. The other question I had was to do with reserves. You said that reserves are fairly similar to our previous year when you actually get down to the sort of, the bottom line of it. Are we sure that the reserves are going to be big enough, though, bearing in mind, any outstanding uncertainties that might be coming out of the pandemic and things that we don't yet know about that might be costly or may well come out the woodwork, as we actually get to grips with, what had to be, a fairly speedy reaction to the situation that we found ourselves in, during the course of last year and this year.
I think the first point of assurance is we have to complete a going concern statement for the auditors, effectively setting out our financial position in terms of our sustainability, and that's something we've done this year, and the auditors will be looking at that as part of their audit, just to kind of reassure them that we've got significant reserves that allow us to say that we've not got any immediate financial pressures and problems. We have got a policy which is general practice to have general reserves at between 2.5% and 3.5% to support ourselves in terms of any financial immediate emergency. We've kept our general reserves at just under 3.5% for a number of years, and in all my years here I've never known us to touch that reserve, so not had to call upon that reserve at all. We also have an earmarked reserve which is for financial volatility, which is currently at 40 million, which is quite significant in terms of our reserves, which is there for the very purpose of dealing with future pressures, to allow us time effectively to make sure we're balancing our books. So, and the Section 151 officer is required to make a statement when we set the budgets to ensure council that our reserves are adequate for us going into the future, and we include that with our budget statement each year.
Thank you for the response. I'm very comforted. Ian, I'm sorry we finally got round to you.
No problem. What I would also just say to back up Michelle, every audit firm that I know has this year put increased emphasis and requirements on the going concern statement. They're all doing additional work, spending more money, but it's a requirement that they have to do to discharge their professional requirements this year. So the going concern has really got a lot more emphasis and a lot more work going into it. So it'll be interesting to see what they come out with. There's 3 points really from me. Number one is on the analysis of just the COVID spend. That's extremely helpful. I think my question, it's not a requirement, is that when we look through the front end of the narrative report, to understand it contextually, it would be helpful to have a little bit more forward-looking stuff to tie into some of the points the other members have made, that said about, well, okay, this is the bit that was pure COVID, what else? We saw the suppression, we can see some things coming down the line. You almost start answering the question around the, are the reserves good enough piece? The answer is so what is your best estimate about what may be happening? Now, I know naturally councils, civil service, etc., are naturally hesitant about putting something down because they might be wrong and people tend to shout at them. But I think for me, that contextual piece about what's missing about almost apart from the COVID will be a challenge, I think, to see if we can have a look at. Two technical questions. Page 86, note 24, the provisions. We've got a series of provisions there. The insurance claims, so just to go through them, the insurance claims, we've had usage, but we've not topped up. So is that a specific drain on a specific provision, or is that just a rolling balance that we're happy with? Then we've got the IT security storage, the voluntary overtime provision, and the home care provision. Now, they were both created prior to the 1st of April 2020, and possibly even pre that. There's no movement. So there will potentially be a question that says, so what are they for? Are they just another back pocket? And as an accountant, I always applaud that, because people always ask you for stuff and you've got to find it from somewhere. But it is about specifically what are we looking at with those, and are they still valid? And my third point, Michelle and I were discussing this earlier, I raised it last year, I'll raise it again this year when it comes to page 113, which is the senior officers' remuneration piece. Now, it is quite mandated about what needs to go in, as in a minimum. I still would challenge to say is we could do a little bit more in trying to get the message over if it's challenged. So we had a lot of people moving up within the bandings, and the bandings changing themselves. So you've got a lot of these people have received over 2.75% pay inflation in their base salaries. Pension contributions have gone up, employers as well. So you're looking at, again, just picking one up, the director of resources, etc. That was a 16% last year, it's 17% this year. So it's a number that can be had mischief with, which we know the Alliance will have a go at. But actually, there is a bit about saying we need to handle what that looks like as a message, potentially, compared to what people will see, because we know they'll go for it. But 2.75, nearly 3% pay increase in the environment we've got at the moment may well be challenged. Therefore, let's get on the front foot in terms of narrating our story on that one.
Could I add a bit to Ian's comment as well, which relates to a similar sort of thing? One of the consequences of where we are with the pandemic or endemic is that we are getting into, as Ian pointed out, wage inflation. But on the construction side, I mean, the inflation levels at the moment on some of the products that are used in the construction industry are quite significant as well. We're talking about 5, 6, 7%. When the budgets are put together, in past years, it's been probably relatively easy because inflation has been, 0.5%, 1% or whatever it is. If there is a significant degree of uncertainty in terms of what the inflation level might be across the board or in particular areas, how do we know that we've got that adequately covered in terms of the figures that have been put together within the various departments to cover their costs, over the year or over the future year?
Maybe if I could just start backwards then, that might help. So in terms of inflation, we absolutely are seeing some growth in costs across the construction. That's already filtering through into tender prices we're getting back for things like Grantham Southern Relief Road and Spalding.
How's that been assessed then? Because, this has happened fairly quickly. And if figures were being put together in January, they may well be quite different now.
They absolutely are. That's my point. So we set the budget in February for the capital programme, as we do each year. We review it each year. Since that budget was set, particularly for some of the major construction schemes, major road schemes, we know that those prices are coming back higher than what we've budgeted for. So before any decisions made to carry on with those projects, we'll need to look at the programme as a whole and whether, as an affordability, whether we need to revisit some of the profiling of that 10-year capital programme, and that's something we'll do over the early autumn with the executive in terms of our budget setting. But for example, steel prices are coming back and they're very high at the moment. I suppose what we don't know is how long that will carry on for, but definitely some peaks in construction and costs at the moment. But sorry, the only inflation areas I'm aware of at the moment, in particular of kind of pressing concern, are on capital costs on construction. Are you referring to other areas?
I'm sorry, I'm not pressing the button at the right time.
I can't hear you very well.
I seem to be pressing it at completely the wrong time. You just reduce your capital programme if your capital costs go up, and you can balance the books that way. But wage costs are going up. The wage inflation in some areas is quite significant. It's 5 or 6%. It might not be in local government at the moment, but that might not be the case forever.
So our wage inflation, obviously that's a national kind of local government wages, as in terms of what we earn, is nationally negotiated. We make an assumption in our planning about what that might be. If it's massively larger than that, then it will be a problem for us, but it won't just be a problem for us, it will be a problem across the whole sector. So we make some assumptions in our planning about what those increases might be. What we are seeing, I suppose, is some sharp increases around the construction industry in terms of pricing generally, relating to labour market and materials, and that's predominantly reflected in our capital programme though, rather than our revenue costs. Am I okay to just carry on with the other questions from Ian then?
Sorry, yes.
Absolutely understand the just obviously comment about suppression and forward looking. We'll cover that probably in some of our reporting going forward, but can absolutely look at the narrative report to kind of pick some of that stuff up. In terms of the provisions, the insurance claims provision effectively based on claims we know we've got in the system. So if it's reduced, then it will be because we've done an assessment of all of the claims in the system and looked at what the liability is planning to be on that. What you will see though is on the reserves, the insurance reserves actually increased. So we have obviously the reserve that looks at the provisions, the premiums, and generally the insurance position generally for the council, and that reserve has increased. The provision's very much based on actual claims. The reserve is there to support the whole insurance piece. You've got a follow-up question?
Yeah, just a quick one. So again, when I'm looking at those numbers, if we've looked at what we've got in the tank, utilisation, it's either a case of, that would only suggest, given the way we only put it in one column, that's actually, we're only utilising known provision, sorry, we utilise it against known costs, yes, and known, etc. Yeah. But there are no new ones. That's what that would suggest, because there's no addition going into the provision itself.
The provisions moved. That doesn't mean there's not any new ones.
So that's where I'm getting on here. Auditors might challenge that, because that looks like a net number as opposed to additions and actual utilisation. That's what I'm kind of saying.
All right. Okay.
Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah. 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 So we can look at that. I presume if we've not got any additional provisions in the year, it might mean that we've not added anything. But if the change is a net change,
it's grossing up, but yeah, it's fine. But again, it probably won't be material. But just to flag in.
Yeah, so I'll check if that's a net change. In terms of the others, if the provision hasn't changed over the year, it will be because it's been reviewed and there isn't any change to put in. I know the IT security storage one in particular was a planned piece of work to shift our data storage solution from SunGard to Azure. And that work was delayed, and the provision was about dual running while we've got two systems in play. That change hasn't happened, hence the provision hasn't changed, because we're still expecting to dual run, but that change hasn't happened. And I'm assuming it's the same for the home care provision as well. There will have been changes and dual running that we were expecting to put in place for a change of service delivery, and that won't have changed because that will have been delayed. The salary payments question. we addressed this question last year, and to be honest, we get an annual question or an annual statement made by the Taxpayers Alliance, and it's usually about the Town Hall Rich List, those officers that earn above a certain amount, which is usually £100,000, and they usually list off each authority, how many people that we have. But apart from that, we don't generally have inquiries about the information in the accounts on that, and the auditors have never come back and said they're not happy with what we're presenting. So I'm not going to suggest changing it. If we get a load of press inquiries about it, then I'll maybe be proved wrong, but we present what we need to present, and if we do get any comms about it, then usually we'll make a statement back about our justification for those levels of salaries.
Andrew.
On that subject, Chairman, again in my day job, we have a very rigorous target requirement, actually. We must not spend more than 1% of our NHS budget on running costs, on staff, offices, etc., etc. And that is a comfort as an audit chair there, because if you ask the man in the street what percentage of the NHS budget is spent on suits and administration, you'll get 8%, 10%, 12%, and they're shocked when you tell them it's 1%. Is there any such benchmark in local government, Michelle, and how would Lincolnshire match up against it?
Well, there aren't benchmarks in the sense of controls around how we make decisions about spending our money, because the controls are all within the council. So it's a locally decided budget. We make our priorities based on local decisions, and things like value for money are picked up through our requirements in terms of our procurement requirements and our recording and reporting in terms of, and again, it's something that's audited to demonstrate whether we're providing value for money for the Lincolnshire pound effectively. So we don't have the same controls as the NHS does, which is obviously a national kind of model of spend, very much different in terms of the accounting requirements and the controls involved, because it's very much local decision making. And whilst the pay inflation for the workforce generally is a nationally decided kind of discussion, those chief officers, that will be part of a public decision making process. So I don't think we don't have those controls, because it's all very much local decision. Locally decisions might include things like we contract services rather than employ people. So having those kind of percentages about what percentage of your workforce is, you know, absolutely. So you're not really comparing like we like.
Thank you. Have we got any other questions? Because I've got one final question, but I don't want to monopolise the questioning. No? I'm afraid it's back to page 10 and the table that we've got there, and it's been covered before, but I'm still would like some clarity if at all possible. It's to do with the underspends in the service areas. Is that because the demand wasn't there, or is that because we couldn't satisfy the demand, or is that because it was funded in different ways, or is it a combination of all three?
Absolutely right. It's a combination of all three. So, the largest underspend there you'll see on that table is in adult care and community wellbeing, and that's very much a mixture of all three of those things. We had planned spend that didn't happen because resources were redirected to other things, particularly in like the public health arena. Those redirected resources, those costs were picked up by grant, so we received grant to cover those costs that we hadn't really planned for, and some things were delayed, so we put cost pressures into the system to change our delivery of home care, but actually that change didn't happen because they were too busy responding to what was going on. So, and I think that's reflective on to some degree through all of the services. So there were some changes we planned to make that just didn't happen, and so those costs didn't happen. In things like children's centres, some of the commission services they provide didn't happen. They were dealing with different responses, and the costs of the things that people were doing instead were picked up very much by the government grant. So
Thank you. So look forward to the next year's report and see.
There'll be an element of this that filters through very much into 21-22 already. So the government grants have continued for the first quarter of 21-22. We've already received 15 million of general grant and more than that in terms of the specific grants for the adult care market as well. So some of that will continue into the new year. Thank you, Michelle.
What questions from Councillor Whittington?
Yeah, but not just a question. There's a paper that went to the executive last week around the underspends from 2021. The underspends on the service lines are being rolled forward into this financial year. So any underspends, I mean, and the two principal areas of underspend, obviously, were adult social care and children's social care. So those underspends, I think there is an understanding that the part of that is this issue of depressed demand. So those underspends are being rolled forward, and as part of that paper, which will go to full council in September, the financial volatility reserve, which is currently at 40 million, did get at the start of last financial year it was 50 million. We drew on it for 10 million in the year. That is going to be replenished back up to 50 million. So there'll be that. Plus the 16.2 in the general reserve, and there's a specific COVID reserve of 2.3. So I think that's what, 67 million pounds roughly, 68 million pounds that is there potentially if things really do go. But I'm looking at Michelle, and I don't think that we'll be in that sort of situation. Thank you.
No, the balances will be rolled forward. I think probably one level of assurance I can give is one thing we have done is tried to make sure the money's gone to where it's been needed. So an example I can give you is when we started to receive emergency grants at the beginning of the pandemic, quite a lot of authorities just uplifted some of their contract values, especially in the adult care market. We've done a lot more work than that. We've made sure we're trying to maintain the sustainability of our care market, making sure they're getting the funding they need and asking them to come to us and highlight costs and things and reimbursing them. So the money's gone very much where it's been needed. So that has, that's helped our financial position as well.
Thank you very much for that. Any more questions, or are we now looking for a proposal in relation to the audit statement? I'm suggesting that the action required was that we scrutinise and comment on the draft statement of accounts, and I think we've done that. And if you're all content, I would propose that they're now handed over to the auditors to actually go through the detail, and that we look forward to receiving them again in September, I think it is. Is that right? Is anybody happy to put that forward as a proposal?
Quite happy to second.
Well, I propose it, you second it. Okay. Is that all right? Thank you. Oh, yes. We better put it to the vote, please. All those in favour? Anybody against? Anybody abstaining? No, unanimous. So moving on to the next item, which is item 7 on the agenda, which is the Information Assurance Annual Report. The recommendations are set out in the front piece, and I believe that David is down to do it. He's doing it remotely, is he? There you are. So over to you, David, if you want to start presenting this report.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon. So the Information Assurance Annual Report covers off key areas of activity undertaken over the previous year. Before I cover off the 3 domains of records management, information security and data protection, I thought I'd just give a general comment on the year. You'd be unsurprised to learn that the pandemic has had an impact on our work for the first part of the year, and our team is very much focused on supporting colleagues deliver directly those services to respond to the pandemic. A good example of that is our work with our public health colleagues in delivering those services, understanding new data sets coming into the council, and making sure that we maximise opportunities for that information that's been received, but also managing wider information security risks. We moved to a new working from home model, obviously, and it was important that we understood any new risks and put in place controls to mitigate those risks. Good example of that is Zoom video conferencing software. As you know, Zoom went stratospheric when the pandemic kicked off in its use. I'm not just talking about locally, but also globally. Unfortunately, it wasn't the most robust piece of software, so we had to work very quickly and effectively with colleagues to make sure they could use that software whilst also managing those risks. And feedback from Children's Services showed us that that work directly impacted the ability to work with families and work with children. So we're very pleased about that work. More generally, the Information Assurance Services ran without any interruptions, bar some project work, which I'll come on to in a moment. And we continue to have excellent engagement from all directorates, and particularly those that deal with the more sensitive information. Again, that's unsurprising. Moving on to the more specific domains, data protection. Data protection, we had an interesting year. A key example of that is Brexit. Obviously, Brexit changed our relationship with the wider EU, and that had the potential to undermine the free flowing of data between the UK and any services we consumed in the EU. But we undertook work to understand that risk, and we put in controls to mitigate that risk to the point where actually the risk to the council was negligible. In more sort of business as usual work, we continue to commit resources to supporting information owners to make sure that information remained visible across the organisation. And a good example of that is where we initiated work to better understand, I should say, our use of surveillance systems, so the likes of CCTV, body-worn cameras and dashboard cameras. So we're now in a very good place to understand our use of those across the council, who uses them, who owns them, and what our legal basis is for their use. I'm also pleased to report that within the data protection remit, we achieved the highest yet mandatory training figures of 92%, which is an excellent figure. That demonstrates that colleagues are undertaking the training, but also demonstrates that the council as a whole understands their responsibilities and takes them seriously. Moving on to records management. As I said earlier, the project within records management to look at legacy records was the only area of information assurance which suffered because of the pandemic, and that was because of social distance rules. But we were able to refocus colleagues to carry out work which continued to add value to the project. So as you'll see in the report, we were able to cleanse over 250,000 records to make sure they were more accurate. And this in turn helps colleagues across the council quickly find information. But we're also focusing on the here and now and looking to the future. So we've introduced a new classification scheme based on the local government classification scheme, which helps colleagues structure information, gives us better visibility of information across the council. As you can imagine, that's quite a challenge because of the diverse nature of the services that we provide. But that's worked very well and gives information asset owners a much better view of the information that they're responsible for. And at the same time, we undertook a review of retention periods across the council. So that's those periods that dictate how long we keep information for and before disposal. And that was informed by legal obligations and business need. And as I say, we work closely with information asset owners to make sure they remained accurate. Moving on to the final domain, which is information security, which includes some elements of cybersecurity. Pleased to report that overall there was a 12% reduction in the number of security incidents reported to my team. That followed with a 41% reduction in the number of data breaches reported to the Information Commissioner's Office. Those figures are really good to see and demonstrate that the council continues to raise awareness across the council to make sure staff understand their responsibilities and take those responsibilities seriously. Less positive, I guess, is the cybersecurity picture. So we're seeing not just locally, but also nationally and globally, a change in cyber attacks, both in their sophistication, but also in their scale. And we're also seeing some examples of attacks within the sector. which are having a devastating impact. And I'll use the example of Hackney Borough Council, who had an attack earlier last year, and they're still recovering. So the damage that has been done there is fairly catastrophic. But as I say, we're also seeing an increase of attacks in education and also in the health sector, sorry. And it's very obvious that the attackers aren't concerned with the area that they're hitting, they're interested in making money. So it's really a matter of concern and one of the highest risks on our risk register. I think also what's interesting is our data reflects that also. Some of the data in the report shows that we prevented over 70,000 malicious emails getting into colleagues' inboxes, but we also prevented over 1 million internet threats. So our own local picture, I think, also reflects that of the national and the global picture. Unfortunately, our controls aren't always 100% effective, and we did have what we would class as 3 successful cyber attacks. One of those was a bank mandate fraud. Fortunately, the money was recovered, and the other 2 attacks were related to phishing. So an email received by a colleague, they clicked on a link, and unfortunately we lost their password and other credentials. But both of those attacks were quickly identified, and we responded very well to them, minimizing the impact to the council. So it's really important that we continue to work with our technical colleagues, and we have done that through the previous year. We've improved a number of different controls, but unfortunately, cyber attacks are now a fact of life. So we have to make sure that that work continues. In summary, then, I think across the 3 domains, it's been a very busy year and a very challenging year. But I think, and I hope that the report evidences that the Information Assurance Service continues to be effective. It demonstrates that we continue to be relevant to the council's needs. And I'm very proud of the work that the team has undertaken over the last 12 months. That concludes my comment. I'm happy to take questions or other comments.
Councillor Copeland.
Yeah, just one. With thousands of council officers working at home this last year, how can we be sure that breaches were not made off those open screens sitting in those properties by others to use for fraud?
So it's a good question. We rely very much on a number of aspects. So we have clear policies in place which set out what we require council officers to do while they're working from home. We work constantly with colleagues across all services to continue to raise awareness. But essentially, we do rely on individuals reporting incidents. If you're talking about malicious activity, we have a variety of controls across all of our systems, including management controls, our colleagues in audit, our colleagues in fraud, who you're going to hear from later on. And together, these controls try to mitigate the risk of fraud being carried out by people working from home. There's no evidence to suggest locally, but also nationally, that fraud has increased. I'm sure fraud colleagues will also have a comment that fraud has increased because colleagues have worked from home. But I'm fairly confident that the controls we have in place will be able to identify such activity taking place.
Mr. Houndenby.
I'd have a quick question on page 353, the records management, if that's all right.
Yes.
There's 2 bits actually there. One is it's the at the bottom, the 4th and bottom paragraph saying we're going to extend the time frame, but therefore, okay, to what? Any sort of scale on that one? That's a bit open-ended. And then you mentioned the fact that unknown historic issues with off-site records. That makes me nervous on so many levels. Could you give me a little bit more information, please?
Of course. So in terms of the timescale, what we have done, we've initiated a new project to support smarter working project. As you can imagine, as we start to reconfigure office space and decommission buildings, there's going to be a displacement of records across the estate. So we've built a single process to tackle both the displacement of records and to understand and index and dispose of the legacy records, bringing that onto one place, we have a new 4-year project. So that's the time frame we're working to now. Like you, I'm very nervous about records, unknown records across the council estate. And the sort of examples I can give you are records which perhaps have been around for decades, which are in the likes of basements or barns, believe it or not, and other areas where records have been managed to a point, but staff have either moved on or the building's being reused as under council services, and the records have been forgotten about. So what we're doing is undertaking a large exercise to review all of those locations to try and identify, index and dispose of those records. It is a key challenge, it's a big challenge, but I'm very confident and hopeful that the new project, working alongside Smart Working, will reduce those to a minimum.
But you said over 4 years, but obviously
Yes.
the activity within that, the prioritisation, the stratification in terms of risk, I think personally I'd like to see a little bit of an understanding of that from a Audit and Risk Committee to understand how that's being tackled, because otherwise, yes, that might be 4 years, but if we don't do anything for a year, we've got a very real risk sat there. I know we won't be doing nothing for a year, but I'd just like to get more of a sense of flow, prioritisation, please, and risk.
So I can give you assurance that certainly when we started with the council campus, we focused very much on children's and adults records. So those are the records that pose the biggest risk to the council and to members of the public. So undertaking that work, we've done a huge amount of work to reduce those holdings to an absolute minimum. But you're absolutely right. We need to prioritise the work in the right areas. And as records become known to us, we will do a very quick index, very quick review to understand where they sit in terms of priorities.
Can I say I've got exactly the same concerns that Ian's just raised, and had he not raised it, I would have raised it as well, because it does seem as though we concentrate on the digital information to a certain extent and almost forget about the paper copies that probably are equally important and arguably may well be equally accessible if we're not careful. Could we have some sort of report to this committee on this aspect, included into the work plan, so that we've got some idea of what the priorities are and what the timetable is and how long it's going to take to actually address the issue, particularly as it's going to be impacted on the various building moves and the various building dispersals or whatever it is associated with the Smarter Working project. Is that all right?
Absolutely. Can I just say the legacy project, which has been going on for a number of years, we've already have a timetable and a plan in place. The second part of the project, which is supporting Smarter Working, but also looking at wider legacy, wider relevant records across the estate, that's just in the setup process. But I'm more than happy to bring a report forward with timetables, setting out a clear plan on what we intend to achieve and when by.
Thank you very much. Councillor Bunny, you have a query.
Thank you. It's again to do with these records. I too feel that that's a very important thing which needs to be looked into. My concern is a little bit to do with the fact that we keep being told about the current estate. I would be interested to know whether, or how we know, whether those records might be in previous properties owned by the council, which have now either been transferred to schools or even disposed of, if these records were just left lying around, that make sure that they are being dealt with.
Any comment on that?
Yes, absolutely, and you're absolutely right to raise it. There is a decommissioning process which is in place, so when property look to decommission a building, we work very close with them to make sure that all records are recovered from the relevant building. We also work with service areas to make sure that happens and to mitigate the risk. So when properties are decommissioned or handed over, they are free from any council information. The records I'm talking about in terms of legacy are very much within current council estate, but I'm confident that the decommissioning process is fit and proper.
Thank you. Councillor, sorry, you want to come back, Councillor Bunny?
I'm glad to hear that you're confident now. I'm just interested in some of these buildings which in fact were decommissioned some years ago. Are you confident that they were all cleared of documents that should have been returned to the council estate?
I think a key indicator of an issue would be that we would be told about any issues which have been identified, whether that's the new occupant or members of the public finding these records. And security incident reporting suggests we haven't had any of that, certainly in the last 3 years. I'm happy to go back and see if there are any other examples of that, but there's nothing to indicate that that has happened, which gives me some confidence. Obviously, I can't be completely 100% confident that that hasn't happened, but we do base it on the indicator of security incident reporting.
Well, perhaps that's a little bit of extra work then, just to see if that has actually happened or not, and that there aren't schools and academies that have got all sorts of confidential information in their basement that's never been looked at since changes were made. Could I leave that with you as well, please?
Yeah,
Councillor,
yes, sir.
Councillor Skinner, you had a query as well, I believe.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Chairman. I was handicapped there. Yeah, there's a couple of things. Rather, we've got the records management. We've got nothing to say how much of those records is part of the whole thing. It's been partially answered, but there's no scoping document. The 25,000 incorrectly categorised off-site records. There's no management of the wrong set of words. I need to convince myself that there's no impact from those being wrongly categorised. I'm going through this and ended up with more questions, so it'd probably be best to seek assurances by another paper. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any other queries? No, in which case perhaps we ought to try and move on to a recommendation. I think we have read the report dealing with information assurance activity for 2021, that the information assurance function remains effective and relative to the council's needs in the parts almost referred to in the report. But I think we have got this extra concern relating to paper copies, certainly, as well as the one that perhaps Councillor Skinner raised right at the end of it in terms of the in-error records. Can we accept? This is a question for you or somebody. Can we accept the recommendation as it is with a qualification? Is that going to be the way forward? As an additional piece, yes, because I'm not totally sure I could, demonstrating the information remains effective and relevant. Well, it does, but I think it's defective to a degree in terms of the outstanding key risk. Could you add, yes, a third item on it that deals with the point that we've actually raised, which is some additional work is required in relation to the paper record keeping, and should be reported to one of the next. Yeah. Yes, I'll do it that way. Is it? Does everybody understand what's being proposed as it stands at the moment? I think we're saying that we require more work done and reported to the committee in relation to the paper record keeping, but the report as it stands at the moment is acceptable. Is everybody happy with that?
Noted, Chairman.
Sorry, I heard some.
Sorry, are you putting forward an alternative proposal then?
I'm putting forward a proposal, yes, from the committee, which is that we've asked for more work to be undertaken in relation to the paper records and the risk that's been highlighted in the report, but apart from that, we're prepared to accept the report and the recommendations put forward. Is that right? I don't know. Councillors, I'm proposing it. Is anybody prepared to second it?
I'm quite happy to second that, but we can pick that up in the work programme as well, Chairman.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yep. So I propose it, second it. Is it all in favour? Anybody against? Anybody abstaining? No. Thank you. So moving on to agenda item 8. Agenda item 8 is the report on the annual report of the Monitoring Officer for 2021. And who is going to present this one?
That's me,
Sorry?
Mr. Chairman.
Yes, you're there. Thank you very much.
I am. Wasn't sure what I was going to look like until I
Over to you,
came up on the
David. Can you
screen, but
report?
I'm here.
Can
Yes,
you-
David Coleman. I'm the Chief Legal Officer and the Monitoring Officer of the County Council. So if you're happy for me to proceed, Chairman, this is a brief summary of 2020-21 from the point of view of my responsibilities as the Monitoring Officer. Essentially, that's to ensure lawfulness and standards of conduct. As we've heard several times this morning, 2020-21 wasn't a normal year, so I've tried to pick up one or two of the ways in which COVID impacted on my areas of responsibility. I suppose the most obvious one was that decision-making with the council moved to a virtual environment rather than face-to-face meetings, and I was pleased that the County Council moved quite quickly towards virtual meetings once the necessary regulations were made. I suppose there were two areas that came out of the virtual meetings. One was simply in terms of the administration. It seemed to me that they were administered and went pretty smoothly, and I pay tribute to my colleagues in Democratic Services for the way in which they managed those meetings, and a lot of work went on behind the scenes to make those run as smoothly as they did. I think the second point is that from examples that we saw elsewhere, virtual meetings at least had the potential to shine a pretty unforgiving light on member behaviour. And I think it's a testament to the elected members of Lincolnshire County Council that we didn't see any of those examples in Lincolnshire, and elected members responded well to the disciplines and the protocols of those meetings, and the behaviour was good. I think COVID also impacted on. Oh, sorry, I should just mention there that all the usual safeguards, as Michelle has said, around decision making, even that urgent decision making that needed to be taken during the COVID pandemic, stood up well to the pressures that they were put under, and the usual legal comments, the usual processes were followed in decision making during that period. COVID perhaps also impacted on the second element there, which is the local government ombudsman. So the ombudsman took a decision quite early on in the pandemic that they would suspend their activities for a period while local councils were responding to the pandemic at an early stage. I'm quite pleased that Lincolnshire County Council indicated to the Ombudsman quite early, towards the end of May 2020, that it was able to undertake continued investigations of the investigations that had been suspended, and was in a position to support the Ombudsman to bring their activities back up and running. I think even then, I think the Ombudsman prioritised the cases that were already running and only brought up new complaints to the council as and when the capacity, both within the Ombudsman service itself and within the County Council, was sufficient to enable them to be managed. I think maybe the impact of the pandemic is reflected in the fact that the reports that came into the council were generally anywhere between November 2020 and March 2021, and that there was a reasonably significant rise in ongoing cases at the end of 2020-21, a number of 15 as opposed to the previous year 9, which suggests that some of the numbers that we saw from the Ombudsman were impacted by that initial pausing at the beginning of the pandemic. I've set out some detail of the cases that found fault from the Ombudsman. There were 4 of those which were, as it were, the normal type of report. 2 public reports were issued. These are reports that have to be formally brought to the attention of the council, and that means in these particular cases the executive, because they were cases raising issues which are within the remit of the executive. One of these was a public report relating to flat rate charging for short-term care within adult care. That's a report that's currently going through the process, so that will be considered by Adult Care Scrutiny Committee in the next couple of days, and will go to the executive in September. But in essence, the County Council has already taken steps to bring its policy into line, and will be offering to carry out assessments and reimburse any amounts that individuals may have overpaid. In addition, the LGO issued a second report in relation to an earlier report. So in essence, the County Council used to operate what's become known as a net payment arrangement for third-party contributions to residential care. The Ombudsman raised issues about that quite some time ago. The County Council considered the first report and decided that it wouldn't fully adopt the Ombudsman's recommendations. It made changes to its arrangements and continued to charge on a net basis. The second Ombudsman's report essentially said that he was dissatisfied with that response. That was considered in October 2020 by the executive, and they decided at that point that they would move to a gross payment arrangement at that point. That was partly in response to a review that the County Council had in any event decided that it would undertake within 3 years of the original decision, and that review was brought forward as a result of the Ombudsman's second report. I've included there some numbers around code of conduct complaints. They continue to be really very low. There were 5 complaints, 2 of which got past the initial stage of consideration as to whether they engaged the code of conduct at all, or whether the individual was acting in their capacity as a councillor. And neither of the 2 complaints that got past that stage gave rise to breaches of the code. 2 more points on interest. For the first time this year, I issued a dispensation under the Localism Act for members who would otherwise have had a disclosable pecuniary interest in a debate. That related to the decision that the council took in February this year to set aside money for business support. Very, very central to my thinking around that dispensation was a combination of the numbers of members who would otherwise have been prevented from taking part in that debate, but secondly, the fact that that single proposal was very much tied up with the whole of the budget, and had that dispensation been granted, there would have been a disproportionate effect on those members from being prevented from commenting on the budget as a whole, simply because the budget contained a single proposal, albeit a significant one, around the setting aside of money for that particular purpose. Finally, just on the Regulation of Investigatory Powers Act, very small amount of use of that act in the last year. That wasn't principally driven by COVID. That was largely to do with the fact that trading standards, concentration and priorities have been around activities which don't require that kind of investigatory power, and that's why those numbers are especially low. So that's my report. Happy to take any questions.
Thank you, David. Any questions for David? Ian Alderby.
Hi, David. There's two questions, really. Number one is a request, please. When we are talking about some of the implications, so the net or gross, etc., some sort of quantum, understanding values, numbers, etc., will be extremely helpful. So just trying to get a grasp of the financial potential exposure on some of these decisions in the report, please, would be allow me a little bit more context. The other thing really for me is, of the areas that we have had came up in terms of the faults, it's really going back to the root cause. So we've got responses on we accept it, etc., and we will do stuff. But really it's a case of saying is that that using it as an identification process. So how did these occur? What went wrong? Was it a process missing? Was it a procedural issue missing? Was it a people thing? Was it a training thing? And just using that to go back and say, so what else? And how that is fed back into our internal processes to look at the so what else might we be missing, please?
Would you like me to circulate something to the committee on that? Quite happy to do so.
Yes, please. Any other questions for David? No? In which case, can I have a proposal that the report is noted? Seconded by anybody? Thank you. All those in favour? Against? Abstentions? None. Thank you very much, David.
Thank you.
Item 8 is I think it's the Counter Fraud Annual Report, and it's going to be, the report is going to be presented to us by Diane Downs. I hope Diane is there.
Hello, yes, I'm joining you remotely. Good afternoon. Counter Fraud report I'm bringing today is designed to provide the Audit Committee with some assurance on the delivery of the Counter Fraud plan, and I'll talk you through briefly some of the key messages. The report itself provides an opportunity to look back over the last year of the activity of the Counter Fraud Investigations team. And a bit of context around that. Each year, the Counter Fraud Investigations team refreshes the annual fraud risk assessments, which are brought to Audit Committee, and that helps shape the annual work plan that we deliver. Again, the plan is brought to the committee, and the report I bring today just summarises the delivery of that. 2021 has been a particularly unusual year for us, and like so many other areas of the council, we've had to adapt to the way we work. I've had to respond to emerging risks and deliver at pace, and we've had a peak in investigations as well. So we always allow some contingency within our internal audit, within our counter fraud plan. But this year it was necessary to revise the plans partway through the year. And in November, we brought a revised plan to the Audit Committee to explain what we intended to deliver for the remainder of the year. We have delivered all of the revised plan. That's 100% delivery on that. And that includes the added response to the COVID work and the spike in the investigations that we experienced. Very pleased that in addition to the revised plan, we still delivered 71% of that original plan as well. So very much good progress, and we're very happy with the work that we've delivered. Some of the successes have included the recoveries and loss prevention. In particular, we played a key part in the incident that David Ingham referenced earlier, the £4.5 million mandate fraud attempt. and collectively over the last 10 years, that's brought our contribution to the council to £12 million worth of savings through the counter fraud and investigations team. So hopefully that summarises some of the key points from the report, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Diane. I've got one question to start things off. Procurement in 2021 seems to be the area of fraud that's increased significantly. Is that anything to do with the confusion caused by COVID, or indeed anything to do with smarter working and working from home?
No, I wouldn't say it's necessarily linked to COVID or from working from home. We take part in SIPFA tracking. They do a benchmarking activity. It's not completed by all councils, but it does give us a general picture of fraud risks across the council, and procurement fraud, contracting, purchasing is something that's been a high risk area for a number of years, so it's not new.
No, the point I was making is it's increased in Lincolnshire over the past 3 years, and it's grown considerably in 2021.
I wouldn't say it's necessarily linked directly to COVID. It was an emerging and increasing risk nationally across the sector. So not specifically to COVID, no, and certainly not specifically to working from home either. We've got no evidence of increased risks from the working from home environment. If anything, it's been from external threats. So, for example, the cyber threat that David Ingham referenced, so attempts on procurement through cyber routes, that's been something we've experienced in mandate frauds.
Sorry, just a final point then. So you're saying that this is something that's happening across all local authorities?
Yes, it's SIPFA do a form of benchmarking. And say it is a voluntary participation which we take part in, and procurement is the #1 threat area across, cyber as well, across the whole of the local government arena and indeed the whole public sector.
Thank you. Sorry, Andrew, you've got a query.
Thank you, Chair. Your report on page 9. There are a few outstandings there on training. Is there a training backlog build-up?
At the time the report was delivered, the report takes you to March this year. Since then, we have delivered training. In fact, actually, for the audit committee itself, we did the members' induction, and it is part of an ongoing programme. We did. The Appendix C that you're referring to was the original plan, and we did bring that back to Audit Committee in November, explaining that there would be some delays to some of that because of the COVID response. But we are starting to deliver on that and bring it back on track.
And sorry, Ian, you've got something to raise.
Thank you, Dan. Of the internal cases that we've found and we've dismissed, in terms of the actual opportunity for those individuals, whether it's the process or procedures, have those opportunities now been removed, or are we inherently limited to the fact that we can't shut them down because what they were doing is just normal business as usual? We have to rely on detection and prevention.
Sorry, can you just clarify on that one? Are you saying, do we follow up in terms of processes when we identify a fraud?
So, no, of the people we've dismissed, they were committing fraud via a certain route and a certain opportunity. So that's the only way you can conduct it. The question for me is, their route, their opportunity, has that opportunity been, is it still open? Is it just the fact that somebody else could do it because actually we can't shut that opportunity down, or have we changed the process and procedures that they were doing so it can't happen now?
Yeah, certainly as part of an investigation, one of the routine things we do is look at the root causes around that. So we look at the control environment and identify where the opportunity arose. In some circumstances, schools in particular, it's very difficult to control the environment because we would normally put a control in terms of segregation of duties. You've got perhaps some small schools where you don't have the numbers of staff to be able to do that. So sometimes there is an inherent risk, and that can't be mitigated. But certainly in terms of some of the corporate frauds, we certainly look at the control environment. The big mandate fraud we had, we worked very closely, had an incident management team set up, looked at it, and we have worked very closely with our finance partners to ensure that couldn't happen again.
So to be absolutely precise, please, Diane, of those 5, how many, if may not be able to answer now, what I want to understand is how many of those can reoccur? Because
I would
I
need
appreciate
to look at the
this,
individual
that's fine.
cases in detail, but I can bring a report back.
That'll be absolutely fine. Just an email will be fine. Don't need a full report. Just
Okay,
an understanding.
no
is
problem.
Fine.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Diane, can you include me in the as a CC to that email as well, if that's all right, Ian?
Mm-hmm. Would it help if I sent it to the whole audit committee?
Even
So
better.
you're well informed? Yeah, no problem. I can do
we'd
that.
all be interested in the answer. Any other questions for Diane? Councillor Skinner.
Thank you, Chairman. I was just looking on page 391, a comparison with other local government, and we have 17 fraud cases on that list, and Suffolk have 37. But then I was looking at the column of how much it's spent by authority to investigate, and that the figures look quite large. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think part of that we've headed off on page 383 of the report pack, just to give you a little bit of context around the benchmarking. It's an incredibly difficult activity to do because it's very much like comparing apples with pears. We're not comparing the same data. Some councils will deliver fraud investigations for some of the district councils on their behalf. In Lincolnshire, we coordinate the counter-fraud partnership for our district councils, and although there's a cost attached to it, there's also an income from it as well, which isn't reflected in those figures. Equally, the type of fraud will vary as well. So a benefit fraud, for example, or a single person discount doesn't take a lot of investigation, so it depends on the complexity. And there's no easy comparison because there's so many unknowns, so many differences. In terms of our costs, it's something that I know Lucy is looking at the moment as head of the Assurance and Risk Service. And I'm actually leaving the council myself shortly, and she's using that as an opportunity to review the costings for the service. And I don't know if Lucy wanted to add any further comment on that.
I raised this at the pre-agenda meeting, and apart from that last column, it's almost meaningless, I think. But it's part of benchmarking, and benchmarking shows all sorts of funny issues into play because nobody does the same, measures it the same sort of way. Lucy, you were going to say something.
Thank you, Chairman. I think we have been asked on numerous sort of reports, annual reports, to try and bring benchmarking back. So we did do it. So it does show those differences, but it was, as Diane says, comparing apples with apples. But I also, as heading up the service, picked up the challenge a couple of committees ago, looking at when we were having issues within our audit resources. So I'm looking to streamline and embed the resources going forward. And as Diane says, one of those options is how we can be more effective working smarter across the two teams. So, but also the council has invested in its counter-fraud capabilities. And as the report shows, in terms on return of investment, it has saved potentially the £12 million. So it is about how much we've invested in that service, and we haven't been able to, as you say, compare apples with apples in this particular case. But at least it gives you that insight. So we're not proposing to bring the benchmarking back if that's something the committee, because it wasn't really showing any sort of real good intelligence. If the sector actually does good benchmarking that we can use and that will help, we will bring that to the committee.
I think that's the right way forward. If it's meaningful, bring it back, or until it's meaningful, don't bring it back. Any other questions? In which case, would somebody like to propose that the report is noted?
Sorry, Chair, I've just got a question, actually.
All right.
Did I understand that the team works on behalf of some of the district councils as well? In which case, are the statistics being presented here just for the county council, or are they for the work that they've done across the various authorities?
Yes, I can clarify that. The County Fraud Investigations team coordinates the work of the Lincolnshire County Fraud Partnership, which is a partnership with Lincolnshire County Council, the 7 districts, and the Police and Crime Commissioner's Office. That's largely based around sharing of good practice, and a big major review exercise on that is council tax single person discount fraud. The report that I bring you today is purely on the work delivered for the county council, which is, again, why it slightly skews those benchmarking figures, because the cost is there, but it doesn't necessarily reflect that we do work through the partnership to support with the intelligence.
Thank you for the clarification, Diane. So that's happy. Any other questions? Would somebody like to propose that we note the report? Councillor Skinner, seconded. Councillor Bunny. All those in favour? That's unanimous. Thank you very much on that one. I believe, though, that you're down for the next one as well.
I am,
Diane,
yes, staying on the line for second report I present.
Yeah, whistleblowing report. Over
Yeah,
to you,
so
Diane.
again, thank you. I'm presenting the report to bring to you the annual whistleblowing report. And this just is an item to note to the ongoing activity that we do in receiving referrals to our team. And again, a little bit of context behind this. In recent years, we've reported the whistleblowing later in the year. We've actually brought it forward. We thought it would be more meaningful to report, because we're reporting on the last financial year up until March, rather than waiting until November to report it. We brought it to this one, so you can consider it alongside the counter fraud annual report as well. So the intelligence is a summary of the whistleblowing arrangements that are in place, and that's to support the organisational culture where we encourage people to raise any concerns. It offers an option for staff members and also members of the public to raise any concerns they have of wrongdoing. Not just fraud, we do have some conduct issues brought to us occasionally, and that gets referred on to the relevant service areas. And I'm actually really pleased that the remote operation of the whistleblowing facility hasn't prevented referrals. That was a concern I had quite early in the pandemic, and that concern actually hasn't been borne out in practice. Numbers are down very slightly on the previous year, but nothing significant. We're really pleased that people have still felt confident to come forward, and it indicates that the take-up and the use of the facility at Lincolnshire is really good. Again, comparing to other councils where we're able to, we see that the levels of referrals to Lincolnshire are higher than others. I don't think that's a detrimental thing. I think it's just that people have confidence to use the whistleblowing service and do feel able to raise concerns. Equally, it's quite positive that although we offer the option for I can never say this, to refer anonymously, very few actually do take up that option. They're quite happy to talk to us because they feel confident that we will take the concerns seriously. So the report summarises that. Again, I mentioned about schools. That again is a high-risk area which remains, partly because of the inherent risk areas. But no, really, really good. I'm pleased with the referrals that we receive. Happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Diane. Any questions? No questions, Diane, so that was easy, that one, wasn't it?
It was.
Again, I'll propose this time that the report is noted. Will somebody second it? Thank you, Councillor. So all those in favour? So, thank you very much, Diane.
Thank you.
I think we're down to the final report. maybe not quite. This is a report that Lucy is going to do. Is that right, Lucy? Or am I missing one? Works programme. So this is a work programme for the year. Sorry.
Yes. Yes. Sorry, I took your microphone away from you. Sorry. Just not quite got the timing right. So thank you for that. Yes, this is item 11, agenda item 11, and I would take the report as read, and just note during the discussion there are a number of areas that you've asked to be considered on the work plan. That was to have a deeper dive on some of the limited risks on the strategic risk register, and some report back either through briefing or email or on paper records management, and obviously in the smarter working item that you had on the agenda, you've asked for the in terms of the control environment for the relevant officer to attend. So again, if there's any areas that the committee would like to consider on the work plan, then we'll be happy to take forward. During the last meeting, there was a number of items on IMT that at the pre-meeting around Mosaic and the other outstanding item on IMT where the chairman asked for that to be maybe reconsidered on a work plan going forward. So I will pick that up, but that also links in with some of the comments around IMT that was raised in the internal annual report. So I think that's that's the report as taken. If there's anything else any members want on the work plan, please let me know.
Any comments or any suggestions, Councillor Stokes?
There we go. No, it's just a comment actually. Is this the correct report? Because it's actually the 14th of June report in the pack on modern.gov and online. Has any amendments been made since the 14th of June, is what I'm asking.
No, it should, it might be the wrong cover report, but the actual appendix is, and the actual report hasn't changed in terms of your work plan since the last meeting. But I haven't picked that up, so I'll have a look. Thank you.
Any other comments? In which case, I propose that the report is noted. Oh, sorry. Yes. Yes, Andrew.
I see the last entry on this work plan is Glen Garrard is to be programmed on a date to be confirmed on the integration of health and social care.
Yeah, is that an observation, Andrew? Or, yeah.
Have you any plans on when?
No, it's got to be confirmed. It was just something that was picked up at a meeting, so it's in hand, but we haven't arranged a date. What we have found is that your work programme, as we found today, has got quite a lot of items, so it's quite difficult to schedule things in so that you don't have a 3 or 4 hour meeting. So we are looking and working with that with the chair and vice chair. So once we get that agreed, then I can contact Glenn.
Thank you, Lucy. Yeah, content with that, Andrew?
Yes, Chairman. As you know, there are big changes happening in the health and social care world. CCGs disappear next April, and so on. I might, in that context, in terms of infrastructure and partnership relationships, I would caution delay on Glen Garrard appearing because he won't be able to tell you anything other than speculation at the moment. But if it's something to do with the service effectiveness of health and social care and IMT as impacted by COVID, that's probably a second slice at the same area. It's a very big responsibility for the council, very big partnership area with the NHS The second part, I caution delay. The first part, Glenn might want to tell us that things have not been knocked off course because of COVID and or other things.
Can I ask Lucy to take it up with the chair or vice chairman so that we can, you know, decide when it's appropriate to put it into the works plan? Thank you. Any other questions? In which case, no. In which case, I propose that the report is noted. Is somebody going to second that? Councillor Skinner. Thank you. I believe that is the end of the meeting. I think we finished a little bit earlier than I was expecting, which is quite good. But thank you very much for your patience. It's been quite a lengthy meeting, this one, but quite an important one. And thank you for your support.